Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer with Dr. Josh Hochschild, and today we are going to be talking with Assistant Professor of Philosophy Justin Matchulat about Summa Theologiae. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Matchulat, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your areas of expertise in philosophy?
Yes. So I did my undergrad at Auburn University, did my graduate studies at Catholic University of America, and then at Purdue. And Aquinas is one of my specialties, Thomas Aquinas. I've worked on his moral psychology, the relationship between desire and thinking, and his ethics. So I consider myself a specialist in medieval and ethics and kind of philosophy of human nature. And I've dug into Thomas Aquinas and all these things, and especially into his Summa.
Okay.
Right. So that's those are my areas of specialty. And so I teach these courses. I teach a lot of Aquinas here at the Mount. And I teach it to the seminarians, I teach it to the undergrads and ethics classes and first-year philosophy classes. So a lot of engagement with Aquinas.
So may I ask, what kind of drew you to the Summa itself? It's a very rich text, so what kind of made that your primary focus?
Well, when I was an undergrad, I was at a public university, but the pastor for us, the campus minister, he loved Aquinas. And he was like a little kid. He was fascinated with the Summa. Like he would talk about Aquinas. We visited a seminary one time. He's like, I wonder where they keep the Summa. Like it was this gem there. And so he would, just by his own fascination, kind of got me interested in Aquinas and apologetics and other sort of stuff. But he played a big role in getting me interested in Aquinas. And I never took a class on Aquinas at Auburn, but I was encouraged to read some famous 20th century Thomists. And so I kind of gradually made my way into actually reading little bits of the Summa as an undergrad. I had this fascination and this desire. And then I was working on a paper on faith, and I started peeking into what Aquinas said and reading what he says about faith and everything. And that's kind of when I first started reading it. Actually, one good story is for 2 Christmases, one Christmas I got what I thought was the Summa, but it was just an abridged edition. This was before everything was online. So this was a big deal. Then I was like, wait a minute, this isn't the real thing. So then the next Christmas, when I was in college, I got the 5-volume set for Christmas. And that was a big deal. It was a clean copy. And, I was kind of intimidated, but I had it there and I could peek in and look for questions that interested me.
Interesting. All right. So before we get into the content, can you give us a little bit about the historical background with the Summa and Thomas Aquinas? Yes.
So St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, is born in southern Italy, right? Aquino is the county. That's where we get Aquinas from. His name is Thomas from Aquinas. And a couple things going on at the time. So first, he was a Dominican friar, and that's the order of preachers, the Dominicans. It was a mendicant order originally, but not all the priests could preach at the time. And St. Dominic set up this order of preachers, in part to kind of fight various heresies that were going on at the time. They were going to try to convert people at an intellectual level. So that's an important part of the context. At the same time, you also have, universities are sprouting up. And a big thing is that Aristotle's major works became available in Latin. They had his logical works before then, but his works in metaphysics and ethics and on the soul, etc., all became available. And it was just this whole worldview, very powerful conceptual resources. And so Aquinas is one of the early Christian thinkers to really encounter Aristotle's big works and digest them. This is a huge deal. I tell students it's like if we all of a sudden found Einstein's works and we had never seen them before and we just had stuff from Newton. It was just powerful. And there was a lot of skepticism around it. There were other medieval Christian thinkers that were skeptical of Aristotle and whether he could be assimilated, but Aquinas studies Aristotle under St. Albert the Great. And what you get with the Summa, he actually says it's meant more for beginners, at least beginners in theology, because he's trying to be brief and clear. So the major work, textbook in theology at the time would have been a different work that did not have the best order and arrangement to it, and would have tons of objections and sometimes replies. And he says, this can hamper students and weary them if they get lots of repetition. So what's neat about the Summa Theologiae is, compared to other works at the time and other of Aquinas' own works, it does have this brevity to it. Like he'll only raise a few objections, and then he gives like the best arguments. And it also has this nice narrative structure to it. He says at the beginning, I'll start with God and the procession of creatures from God, and then we consider the human being made in the image of God and the principles by which the human being directs himself to his end. And it talks about the virtues and all this. And then the last part is on Christ, which is our way to God. So he talks about Christ, the sacraments, and so forth. So it has this nice coherent structure to it. It tells a narrative, and it has, people have said, a kind of exit and return structure. We all come from God and proceed from God, and it's how we get back there. That's one of the beautiful things about the Summa as you dig in.
I wonder, just because some people might not have ever looked at the text, and then even those who have might wonder how they should think of what sort of text it is. So you've described one of the paradoxes of it, that it is a very long and imposing text, but on the other hand, there is a brevity to it, and it's in a sense designed for something more introductory, not more advanced. But another thing that people notice, I think, about it, because it tries to be so, its scope is so broad, as you described. It tries to be so comprehensive. Some people think of it as like an encyclopedia that's gathering together everything that a 13th century Catholic should know, or as a catechism, an instruction in the faith. I don't know that there is a consensus view of like how we should describe what sort of text it is, but how do you help students understand what it is they're approaching when they pick it up for the first time?
That's a great question. Yes, I think
all of the above.
Maybe negating those. I don't think of it as an encyclopedia because it has an organic unity to it, right? I mean, that's one of the neat things about when you dig into it more and more, you see, what he says on grace is related to what he says on the Trinity, and, what he says about the basic human powers and our potentialities and the way it affects. So if you think of an encyclopedia as just a bunch of independent articles that don't have unity of principles among them, I think that's how it's not an encyclopedia. That's why reading more and more of it and getting deeper can be exciting, because you start to see the connections, right? And I also think it's not a catechism, so it's not a magisterial statement of the faith. But also, I think the structure of the individual articles is important, that he always starts with a question. He uses what's called the disputed question structure. He starts with a question, and then he immediately raises objections. Just a few, it's shorter. And then he gives, another opinion, and on the contrary. And then he responds to the question. So it could be, whether God exists. He actually raises two of the most famous objections to God's existence. He gives an on the contrary. He gives his response, that famous one where he gives the 5 arguments to God's existence, and then he responds to the objections. So I think that's different than a catechism, because it's teaching the student a certain habit of mind, right? Teaching the student how to take a question seriously and soberly. And part of that is considering the strongest objections to your own position, and then developing your own response in light of those objections and so forth. He started teaching it to what seems to be a smaller group of Dominican students when he was in Rome. So he wasn't at a larger studium, but a smaller one. And it was meant to give them a broader theological formation. Prior, he had been teaching some Dominicans where they were just doing like moral theology and kind of practical theology. And he thought, well, look, they need a broader theological education. And so I think that's a good way to approach it. If you want to move beyond catechism, if you want to move beyond, we might say today, reading blog entries on, and you want a deeper theological formation, the Summa not only gives you content, but also it's organic contents, it's synthetic, and it trains the habit of mind if you really get into it.
So do you think it would be fair to say, maybe not definitively, but that it would be like one of the first intro to theology textbooks, based on what you said with the content and the synthetic nature of it, informative bits?
Yeah, I think you could think of it as an intro to theology, because it's also giving you the habit of mind. But the thing is, it's not, we know, that
it's not
it's not an introduction. So, it's like, it's such a primary work It's like calling Aristotle's metaphysics an intro to metaphysics. There could be something to that, but he's doing theology and philosophy at such a high level. I mean, normally you don't, study intros to works at a scholarly level, but his level was so high when he wrote this.
Okay.
That yes, he meant it as an intro, but maybe one that could sustain people for a long time. Maybe you can get like a more surface level and understanding, but as you could go on and see deeper and deeper connections.
Yes,
that's good.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean like for a 2020 undergrad freshman, like just generally as a relatively introductory textbook.
Yeah, it's questions about how advanced the students were when they started reading this, But yeah, if you're interested in theology and you have a little bit of a background in some terminology and so forth, it's a place where you can dig in. But it's not introductory in the sense that you'll necessarily move beyond it, right? That's where I think it's neat that it has these additional levels of depth to it. So it's got something for the newbie, the rookie, but also something for people that have been reading it for years and years and years. That's what's neat about it, I think.
There's something odd, right, about the fact that you're a philosophy professor and I'm a philosophy professor, and we're talking about a book that we both taught. But it's a work of theology. I don't think it's actually that out of the ordinary, though. In at least in American higher ed, I don't know. I have a suspicion that Aquinas Summa might be more read in philosophy departments in America than in theology departments. And certainly the emphasis on great books is not necessarily a primarily theological movement. It's more sort of a humanist movement, and a lot of the books in the great books canon or canons that people talk about tend to be more philosophical. So why this particular book of theology, and why are philosophers at least as interested in it as theologians?
It's a great question. I think it is a work of theology. It all falls under, everything in there falls under what Aquinas calls sacred teaching at the beginning. But there's so much philosophical content within it. And Aquinas had this conception of theological reason where you don't sort of give up kind of ordinary rationality and philosophical principles when you do theology. It's not like you just kind of get the Bible. But what's fascinating is the way he uses all of this philosophical thinking, philosophical arguments, philosophical concepts, and then weaves it into presenting this Christian worldview, right? For example, St. Paul he talks about faith, hope, and love, right? But for Aquinas, he takes Aristotle's understanding of what a virtue is. It's like a habit that develops a power and so forth. He's got to modify it for these theological virtues because they come from God and are ordered towards God. But still, the basic concepts he's taking from Aristotle and then weaving it into the Christian faith. So I think philosophers find just lots of stuff of independent philosophical interest in Aquinas' writings on ethics, on natural theology that is thought about God that can be known just by human reason. And I think they gravitate, towards those parts of the Summa. And there's also something about the brevity, how sophisticated it is, but it seems to get to the point quickly. And I think they appreciate that. So I would say it's all those things. I think people who are especially interested in thinking about theological topics using a lot of rigorous philosophical tools gravitate to this. And then there's just a lot of independent interest to philosophers. So Philippa Foot, a famous philosopher of the 20th century in ethics, and she says, I'm a card-carrying atheist, but she took Aquinas' ethical parts of the Summa very, very seriously. She was a student of a famous Catholic, Elizabeth Anscombe, right? So I guess those are just a few considerations of why philosophers have found this so powerful. I think also it is very humanistic. It gives this grand picture, kind of Christian worldview of the universe that has all this intellectual heritage and philosophy integrated in it. So I was looking last night because I have the great book set, and there's only two thinkers that have 2 volumes to them, Aristotle and Aquinas.
Really?
Right? So they included not all of the Summa, but I think the first 2 parts of the Summa are included in the great book set that Mortimer Adler and others put together.
Oh, so. Interesting. All right. So do you think we're ready to kind of give a briefish overview of the content?
Yeah.
If there can be such a thing.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned there's I forget what the term used is, but there's a bit of a circular overarching structure talking about God and then human beings and then Christ. So would you like to maybe revisit that a little bit and give us some of the content?
Yeah.
In a little bit more detail.
Sure. I mean, there's basically three big parts to the Summa. The first part, the second part, and the third part. They often get named in their Latin, the prima pars, if you've ever seen that. The first part, there's a little methodological intro, and then it's about God. God in his essence, God in the distinction of persons, and then about creatures insofar as they proceed from God. So there's a bit about creation, what creation is, and then there's bits about the nature of the human being and the angels. Mm-hmm. When he gets to the second part, he says, well, now that we've treated of God, we'll treat of his image, which is the human being who, like God, has free decision over his acts. It's like a little Lord, is provident over his activity. So the second section is going to look at the ultimate end of the human being, the goal, the telos of the human being. It starts out with that, and then the sort of internal principles that direct the human being to their ultimate end. Mm. Right? He's going to argue that the ultimate end is the vision of God, the intellectual vision of God, but then that's when he'll look at the emotions, right? Good and evil action, habits, so forth, and again, in particular, virtues and vices and all that. That's all there's two parts of the second part. So three big parts. The second part has two subparts called the prima secunda, the secunda. And then there's the third part, which he says is going to focus on Christ, which is our way back to God. So you get an analysis of, you get Christology, analysis of the incarnation, lots of logical stuff about the various statements attributing, that Christ is God and so forth. And all the stuff on the sacraments. This is where he gives his theory of the real presence in the Eucharist. He actually died while he was writing the third part. And so there's a supplement that's added to it. So you've got three parts and then a little supplement that they added to it from some of his previous writings. But that's the basic structure. You can think of first part is kind of God and creatures as proceeding. The second part is human anthropology and ethics. Okay. And then the third part is on sort of Christ and the sacraments. Okay. Right. And it's nice to, if you ever do pick up the Summa, you can do this on, Alfred Freddoso has a nice translation online because it includes the prologues. It's nice to go and look at the prologues to each of the parts, and you can start to get a sense of the whole. Mm-hmm. So that's the basic structure, just three parts. And it's got a simple overall structure, and then there's just lots of divisions once you get in. Right. One nice thing about the internet is sometimes you can find various sites where it's easy to view things on one page, and you can see all the subdivisions that are there, and you can see why he's proceeding the way he is. So that's the basic structure to it. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that you had studied his psychology, and what was it?
Yeah, the philosophical psychology, you might say, yes. And his ethics.
Is that part of the second part of the Summa?
Yeah, basically the second part of the Summa, but especially the first part of the second part. Okay. And so I really dug in there. But what's neat, what happened, and this happens to a lot of us when we were writing our dissertations, you dig in one place, but then you start to learn all this other stuff because you see how it's connected. Mm-hmm. So a good friend of mine did Aquinas on final causality, but that started connecting to all of these other points. So that's one of the neat experiences of writing on Aquinas. When you dig in, you're just forced to see the connections, the synthetic connections to the rest of the stuff. Yeah, I focused on those sections of the Summa.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was part of the Summa or if that was a separate work of his with the philosophical psychology.
No, well, he does talk about it in lots of separate works. So I worked a lot with the Summa, but that wasn't the only work that it was. So the Prima Secunda, this might be getting off into, but he has another work that I really like called On Evil, and I've got a big copy of it. And it's funny to bring it on an airplane where people are like, oh, nice book. But parts of that were written, it seems, around the same time he wrote the first part of the second part of the Summa. So I was using, when you do a dissertation, you're drawing on lots of stuff. Yes. Right. But the thing is, the discussions in the Summa very closely mirror. You might say the work on evil is a much more advanced work. There's a lot more objections and stuff, but you can get a lot of that content in the Summa. Mm-hmm. Right. So I focused on various parts. But when I started, I'll say this: the first things I read from the Summa, I started with the section on faith and read through that. I think that's a good place to start. When my first year in grad school, really got into the section on the virtue of love, charity. and those were good places for me to kind of sink my teeth in.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the other voices that Aquinas is engaging with. For the Great Books podcast, we're sometimes, I think, describing what counts as a great book as a book that's worth our engaging with, but that sees itself as part of a larger ongoing conversation and dialogue for all of humanity. And you mentioned Aquinas' interest in making sense of and integrating some Aristotle, and he's obviously speaking as a Christian, so he's engaging with Scripture and some Christian authorities. But maybe you could say even more about how Aquinas sees himself as engaging with other voices, and how he treats those other voices, and then also what does he think is special about his particular contribution. So why was the Summa needed as a contribution to the ongoing conversation that Aquinas was inheriting?
Aquinas is someone who took his intellectual heritage really seriously, right? That you might say there was like hermeneutics of generosity. What does that mean? Well, he interpreted those great thinkers that came before him in a very generous way, and he was interested in truth. And he would kind of take the truth from whatever source it came from, right? And if it came from Aristotle, he thinks, well, let's incorporate it, right? So I see this attitude of just taking the inheritance really seriously, not trying to kind of throw off tradition, just let's be free of everything and start anew. I mean, I think he would have thought that's dumb, right? There's great minds out there, and people have learned stuff, and we should learn from the great minds. So I think he approaches these other thinkers. It's not just Aristotle. There's Neoplatonist thinkers, so followers of Plato, tons of church fathers. Augustine plays a huge role, but also Greek church fathers, Eastern church fathers. And he's also taking from Islamic philosophers who themselves are indebted to Aristotle, like Averroes and Avicenna. So it's just this kind of generosity towards these thinkers. What can I learn from them? What can I take from them? And, he's happy to cite people all over the place. So I think he's a master synthesizer. I think what he does is, look, you have all these disparate sources, and, Augustine is powerful, but a lot of his works have a kind of specific, maybe more narrow purpose or something. And Aristotle's powerful, but my gosh, for most people to go through Aristotle's corpus is very difficult, right? And he's seen that. But a lot of people, there aren't even libraries. Well, there are libraries at the time, but it's harder to get books at the time. There was no printing press and so forth. So if he can make this synthesis, I mean, he's going to add his own original thought to it, but there's originality and something beautiful in the way he's able to take all of these sources. There's a saying of St. Paul, test everything, except what is good. Test everything, hold fast to what is good. He's able to take these sources, then unify them into a synthesis, and a synthesis in the Summa that has a particular order to it. And the order is there for the student reader, right? They're going to start with God and then move to human beings in their end, and then to Christ, right? So within that order, that kind of natural theological order, he can synthesize, take in all those sources and use them to express his arguments, his thought, and so forth.
Okay.
Right. That's what I think is really remarkable about it. And it's something to learn from. The fact just first of all, how familiar he was with all those sources. So how much time, he wrote commentaries on, I think, all the works of Aristotle that he had, or nearly all of them. He also wrote a lot of commentaries. Well, he wrote commentaries on Scripture and so forth as well. So the time he spent with those thinkers to learn from them was really remarkable, right? So to learn from them and then, take what they had and put it into a new synthesis, there's really something to learn from. It's just, you just imagine just an extremely cultured mind, right? Sort of beautiful cultured mind, but that was also interested in truth, not just like the history of ideas. I think he says some point, the point of philosophy is not to know just what people have said, but to know the truth, right? But this is sort of a vehicle for knowing the truth, is you've got to take seriously what your forebears have said. I think there's a lot to learn from Aquinas in that regard.
I like how you put that too, both the humility of it, but also the ambition of it. There's an image that I read, and I'm not going to be able to quote it, right? But it's vivid enough to stick in my memory of someone describing Aquinas's mind as like a lake that collects from streams of all directions, and then lets things sort of settle out. So if there's any debris, It just goes to the bottom, and Aquinas lets the clear water sort of be itself and shine and reflect the heavens. It's a very very powerful image, but it also, it might, if someone just heard that, it might suggest a kind of passivity, like all he had to do was be a receptacle. And it took a lot of work for him to do that.
Oh, gosh.
And it was in the time even a little bit risky. So that, we now think of Aquinas as a kind of standard bearer for tradition and authority, but he was often going out on a limb and saying, no, we can use Aristotle here, or I can show how Jewish thinkers and Islamic thinkers have something to contribute to Christian theology. Right. And I think some of his contemporaries thought he was a little bit of a renegade.
Yes, definitely.
Sometimes. And I think that's also important to remember when you're reading it, that there's what looks like maybe a simple collection of ideas might be a very clever and creative way of bringing voices together that other people hadn't seen how they could be brought together.
That's right. Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned the Jewish voices too, with Moses Maimonides. So he's looking at folks from other faiths and learning from them, learning what they've kind of integrated, but also these philosophers. And I think you're exactly right. It's extremely ambitious, or as Aquinas might say, magnanimous. It shows greatness of soul that he undertook these big projects, which took a lot out of him, but also a lot of humility. It's like, look, it's not me standing sort of on my own and trying to get rid of all this tradition. I think he would have thought, that's not humble, that's proud, right? So it's humble. Let me learn from them, but then take it to a new level. Recognize what my gifts are and what I can contribute. Definitely very magnanimous.
In my very, very limited philosophy education, that seems like a very unique way of, I guess, doing philosophy, if you will. Like, I in no way mean to discount Plato and Aristotle, but it seems like that was very different in that, like, there wasn't so much an emphasis on, okay, here's how you're wrong. But like Dr. Hochschild was mentioning, you kind of let the debris just gradually settle out. It was, okay, so this is what's right. Again, a very, very limited experience, but it seems to be like that's one of the few places where there's such a clear synthesis and not quite so much of a tearing down, because then you get to Enlightenment philosophy and everybody's tearing each other down and you can't make sense of anything. Obviously that was way before, but
I think
just an observation.
No, he probably learned from Aristotle. Aristotle does always say we have to start with what's closest to us. So he often starts with looking at the opinions of his forebears. And he actually says, the true view should save the appearances, save the opinions of the other thinkers, right? Yes. And I'm going to kind of harmonize what was right. I'll get rid of what's wrong. And he's maybe a little bit more explicit about it, but then harmonize what is right. And so you can see that in a lot of Aristotle's works. And I think Aquinas probably learned from that. We've got to start with what's closest to us. And one of them is the views of others. But there's also there's been a lot of thinkers since Aristotle by the time Aquinas comes around. So there's a lot of thinkers that are revered by the church at the time too, so he had a much bigger task ahead of him. Yeah, he's a good model for that.
I wonder if you have like a favorite article to teach, or if there's an example that you could lead us through to point out something about how to read or interpret a short section of text. That's unfair. I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't ask you to prepare this, but since you've taught in different classes, maybe there's an example. And by the way, maybe you can even clarify what I mean by article for those who aren't familiar with that term.
Yes, there's, like I said, there are parts of the Summa, and then within the parts you have questions. Questions are really kind of more like general topics, right? And then within, there's subdivisions, and then you get down to articles, and articles are actually questions, right? Like, well, here's one: whether it is necessary that every being be created by God, right? Is there possible that you could have some created being that wasn't created by God, for example? Let me think. Are there articles I particularly like to teach? One that this combines both philosophy and theology, because he's giving a philosophical argument, but in defense of theology, the very first question of the Summa says whether besides philosophy any other doctrine is required, which might sound odd to our ears, especially if for people who are religious believers, they might think the question is reversed. Do you need philosophy? Isn't like the faith enough and the Bible enough? But at the time, the idea was, look, if philosophy is going to give you an understanding of the universe and even of God himself, as you see in various ancient philosophers, then what need is there for anything higher. And I won't go through the whole thing, but he says, look, it was necessary for the sake of our salvation that there be something above the philosophical disciplines. Because in order to be directed towards an end, and the end here is God himself, he says, quotes, eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has it so much as dawned on us what God has prepared for those who loved him. Mm-hmm. So if that's our end, we need to be made aware of it, right? Yeah. And it's really hard to be made aware of it if you just go the philosophical route. So what he says is, if all we had was philosophical knowledge of God, few would know about God. Those few only after a long period of time. And even then there'd be much error that was mixed in. And so to kind of like expedite the whole process, God chose to reveal himself and give us a teaching that went beyond philosophy that we could then come to know through the virtue of faith. So this is interesting because he gives a kind of philosophical argument that it's fitting that God would have revealed himself and that philosophy isn't enough, because if philosophy was enough, basically the majority of the human race would be in ignorance. But I think in reading an article like that, I've kind of gone through the argument, but in reading, I think it's really helpful to read some people, when they start, will just read the I answer that, and then maybe look at the replies. And that's fine. You can start that way. I really like reading the objections, and even early on, because it creates this tension in your mind, and it helps you understand the question that's being asked.
Yeah, I think that's key. Sometimes you don't know why Aquinas is asking a question.
Yes.
Until you see the arguments that he gives or the authorities that he might cite that seem to give rise to the question.
Yeah, that's exactly. So in this first one, his first objection is, he says, it seems that besides philosophy, we don't need any further knowledge. For man should not seek to know what is above reason. As Scripture says, seek not the things which are too high for you. But whatever is not above reason is fully treated of in philosophy.
Now
Therefore,
that almost seems funny to me. Is it like Aquinas is writing with a sense of humor? He's citing a theological authority, Scripture, for the position that you don't need theology beyond philosophy. Is he having fun there, or is that?
I'm looking at his response. Although those things which are beyond man's knowledge may not be sought by man through his reason, right? Nevertheless, when they are revealed by God, they should be accepted in faith. Perhaps there is a little, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I can see a little bit of humor here. Sort of like when he asks.
Well, I have a minority view that Aquinas is a lot funnier than most people realize, and that he often does choose authorities, that it's not just the argument, but the particular voice he chooses to put the argument in to make a point. So he will sometimes make a point about distinctively Christian virtues, but he'll use Aristotle to make that point, or he'll make a point about virtues as a habit that people will think is an Aristotelian point, but he'll get Augustine to back it up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good rhetorically. It makes sense. Yeah. But I also think there's almost like he's doing it with a glint in his eye. He's like winking at you. See what I did there?
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Or his arguments about the possibility of beatitude in heaven. He cites a line from the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, the pagan, who doesn't have any conception of beatitude in heaven, to say that even the philosopher saw that there must be a difference between happiness in this life and at least some logically possible happiness beyond. And that it's at least very clever of him, his use of sources. But I do think that there's a kind of playfulness in it sometimes where he's really enjoying the way that it's not just what they say, but who says it that matters.
That's right. Well, one example that's related of the humor that people have brought out, the third article, this is very early on, whether God exists. This is the famous one of the 5 ways. The on the contrary says, it is said in the person of God, I am who am. He's quoting Exodus, right? Exodus 3:14. God's basically, whether God exists, God says in Scripture, I am who am, right? So, yeah, I think if you read Augustine's Confessions and then you read the Summa, you'll see that a big difference. Augustine comes out very passionate in the Confessions, and it's really beautiful. You learn something from that, his passionate desire for God. People have commented that in the Summa, this is something you can learn from it too. There's a really sober consideration of these questions and issues, right? You don't find a lot of, he's playful at times, but there's not like biting rhetoric, I'm going to beat down my opponents and call them names and stuff. And Augustine doesn't do that either, but I think there's something you can learn from both. I think there's this sobriety of mind with like little kind of almost like intellectual jokes at times that people that are tuned in will get. But I think that's another thing, a way that I found this really interesting. So T.S. Eliot, great poet, and he was friends with Jacques Maritain, a great French Thomist who was also, he could write with a lot of flavor, you might say. But T.S. Eliot kind of criticized Maritain as it didn't have like the rigor of Aquinas himself. Good poetry has a lot of rigor to it. And T.S. Eliot was able to recognize the Summa and Aquinas' own writing. There's this attention to detail and rigor, almost seeing it with the poet's eyes. It's really beautiful. I think that's what people tend to fall in love with.
Also, Dr. Hochschild, what you were saying about that humor, it kind of made me I know that in his lifetime he was referred to as the dumbox, and just those little intellectual jokes remind you, just makes me think of him writing this and saying, hey, call me dumbox again.
There are various stories about him. He seemed like a very affable person. There's one case where he does seem to get pretty upset with kind of a Aristotelian thinker and kind of challenge the person, argue with us, not with children who could be easily duped. But, normally he has this attitude of generosity towards others. And there's funny accounts too. I mean, so supposedly he was very trusting, and some friars went to a window and said, hey, look, Aquinas, Thomas, a pig's flying out there. And he went to the window and looked out. And then he said in response, I'd rather believe that pigs could fly than that friars could lie, right? Which is kind of a little bit of a jab, but there's some humor in it too,
Is that where the phrase comes from? I'll believe it when pigs fly?
I think that's older than.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And I think that's why, maybe they use that one.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think, so just if I could say a little bit more on the question, reading into it, I mean, I have a quote here from Flannery O'Connor, the great short storyist and novelist. She says this: I couldn't make any judgment on the Summa except to say this: I read it for about 20 minutes every night before I go to bed. So that's an idea. Just pick it up and read it for 20 minutes a day. She says, if my mother were to come in during the process and say, turn off that light, it's late, I, with lifted finger and broad, bland, beatific expression, would reply, on the contrary. I answer that, she's using Aquinas' language, the light, being eternal and limitless, cannot be turned off. Shut your eyes. Or some such thing. In any case, I feel I can personally guarantee that St. Thomas loved God, because for the life of me, I cannot help loving St. Thomas. So this is someone who wasn't a philosopher or theologian by trade, but there was something just a little bit a day that kind of drew her in. And I think it's neat because I think some people are just really intimidated by it, and that makes sense. There's now
volume.
Yeah, that's right. And, you can use, there's various commentary, secondary works and commentaries, and the Thomistic Institute now has nice short videos on it. But I think to just find questions you're interested in and start, not being afraid of it and giving it a chance. That's one way to go. There's also more systematic ways, but.
That quote from Flannery O'Connor is great. And I think it reminds readers that in addition to all the things that you and I might want to emphasize as philosophers, and the way that he can, dialectically use questions to push forward an argument, and his incredible learning and drawing on sources, that it's a work of love. And that if you don't, whatever else you're doing with the text, and you can do all kinds of, high-level intellectual academic things with the text, if you don't somehow see that it is the work of someone who was seeking God and loved God and wanted to help others to love God, that you're missing something. And just saying that helps make aware how rare it is to find those things together, right? I think we tend to think that if you went to the bookstore to find a book that would appeal to the desire to love God, that it would err on the side of being kind of sappy and non-intellectual, or that if you were looking for something that was highly theologically insightful, that it would somehow lack heart. Yeah. And Aquinas is a great reminder that those two things aren't supposed to be opposed, and that a work of devotion and heart could be the work of the finest minds.
Yes. And I think that's a great point. One of the mottos of the Dominican order was contemplating and sharing the fruits of the contemplation. But contemplating, they meant, could mean a lot of different things, but it included your life of prayer. And supposedly Aquinas, there are stories that he would go and rest his head on the tabernacle or weep in front of the tabernacle when he'd run into difficulties. And then when I think I figured it out, and he'd go and write it. Right. And this was a service. I mean, when he started writing this, I think it was originally intended for these, smaller group of friars, but he might have sensed that it was going to go beyond that. But yeah, it's a work of service and devotion, and it's coming out of his great love for God and his prayer life, his devotion to God. These were interwoven in his life. I think that's really important. C.S. Lewis has a great line that, for some people like me, C.S. Lewis says, you get to, in order for something to get to our heart, we need to kind of have a pencil in our hands and a pipe in our teeth and, read St. Athanasius or something like that. And I think, look, there's different capabilities that people have and some different temperaments and everything. But really, if you can gain a deeper understanding and clarity, there's been just a number of times I've read stuff in Aquinas that's sort of freed up kind of difficulties and enables me to kind of understand myself and my faith and the realities I'm thinking about with a lot of clarity. There's a freedom there.
It's beautiful.
There's some barriers to getting into it, but once you get into it, it can open up a lot in you.
Mm-hmm. Well, both of you are medieval philosophers. So do you have any suggestions for like an order in which to read the Summa, or ways, or not necessarily chronologically, but any suggestions to help make it a little bit more accessible for people who aren't necessarily like high level academics? So I know you mentioned just like pick a question that interests you and just read it. Like obviously you want to read the question and then you read, I answer that, then objections, and then replies to the objection. Like I've heard a bunch of different ways to read the text. So do any of you have any suggestions?
I think there's lots of different ways you could go. Someone should feel free to just, if they're interested in faith or hope or love, or maybe they're interested in his views on, I don't know, war, or his views on a particular type of action, to find that in the Summa and read what he has to say on it and try to piece together his reasoning. That's certainly one way you can go. I think it's helpful to read the objection. But I think when I started, I didn't always, and I would read his response. So kind of there might be ways you can enter into the text where you don't look at the objections as much and you pick a little more piecemeal. And then as you go on, you might start approaching it a bit more systematically. I mean, some other suggestions, I like I said, reading the prologues to the various parts, I think is really helpful to get an overview. I think that there is one work I would mention. It's by, I forget the name. He was a Jesuit. It's called the Ethicus Thomisticus. It's online. And it's like an abridgment. But he keeps the questions in, and he'll take out some of the objections. But that's a nice kind of presentation of the second part of the Summa.
Like an actually good spark notes of the Summa.
Well, no, it's actually Aquinas' own text.
Oh, really?
It's just an abridgment, so it takes out a lot of the objections and some of the replies to kind of simplify it. And it's a nice translation. So for some students, that's been helpful in kind of getting them over some of the hurdles of addressing Aquinas' structure. And for some people, that is a hurdle. Now, for others, I've had very early students who say they really like the tension that's created in reading the objections and so forth, and you do learn from that. But I think there's just different ways you can go. But I think don't worry about the restrictions. Just start reading someplace that's interesting. Okay. That's what I did. Okay. And then I got to a point where I read it more systematically. That's what I would say. Okay. What do you think?
I think Justin's given some really excellent advice. I mean, one thing that I would say right up front is just do it. Just read it. Don't be intimidated by it. Don't think you need a lot of preparation. It's a challenging text, sure, but any book worth reading is a challenging text. Could you spend a lot of time studying its background and history and preparing to read it? Sure, and maybe certain people need to do that. But don't be intimidated by it either because it's so intellectual or because Aquinas was, a saint and a doctor of the church. Just like he's a human being writing about ideas that we all care about, and just pick it up and read it. The other thing that I think Justin's done a really good job describing is the fact that it has a structure, and actually a very, very carefully crafted, layered structure. So the thing as a whole has a design, but then each of the parts has a design, and then each of the questions, and then each of the articles, and even within the article, you use the word tension. So look for the drama of that. There's something that can feel very artificial and abstract about the style because of this format of the article with the question that's formulated and the objections and the sed contra and the reply to the objections, and all of that can feel very artificial. But it's artificial in the way that the rules for a poetic form can be artificial. They impose certain limits on Aquinas, but within those limits, there's a tremendous amount of freedom. And the question format, I think the true sort of ancestor of it is the Platonic dialogue. And a lot of people think there couldn't be anything different, more different than a Platonic dialogue in Aquinas' Summa. But Plato used the dialogue form to create conditions under which he could control the questioning through one character and the kinds of things that the questioner would respond to through the other characters. It's very artificial, but it's full of drama. In a similar way, Aquinas is using a format that forces him to accept a kind of back and forth and allows him to control what questions he's framing and where he's framing them and in relation to what other framing. So I guess my bottom line, if this is meant to be practical advice, is look for the structure. Look for how it is that within a particular article that Aquinas is structuring the things that he says. Look for how that article plays a role in a larger question. Look for how that question plays a role in a larger part. Sometimes in my own experience, I didn't appreciate what Aquinas was doing once at the end of a long question full of many articles. I didn't understand what he was doing there until I saw what the last article did, and then noticed that the last article helped him make a transition to the first article of the next question. That sort of taken as a set, there were puzzles for me about what was going on. Why was he talking about virtue in this way? But then when I noticed that he needed to get to a certain point so he could make a transition, I think it was a transition from talking about natural to supernatural virtues. All of a sudden, I saw things that I hadn't appreciated earlier because I saw how he put it. And that the importance of structure then is the advice that I would give to look for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the drama. And if the first experience, if you can get yourself in the mindset of how in the world is he going to answer that objection? That's like a good experience. Like, there's no way. Like, you want to, then you've gotten caught up in the drama. He asks a question, and like,
even though you know that there's like 2 pages of material on that
he's got to say something, but it's like,
no way he's going to.
I've experienced that a number of times. So I like what Dr. Hochschild said. It's difficult, and that's normal. Like, it is a difficult text. I mean, any book worth reading is going to take you out of your comfort zone a little bit, and a lot of people have started and have been able to make headway. I have a friend. He said I think he read the Summa when he's in 8th grade. He was a bit of a genius, but a lot of us. I started out very, very slow, and gradually things started to make more sense.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for coming and for sharing your knowledge about this giant work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.